Dr. Eolene Boyd-MacMillan is a social psychologist based in the Department of Psychology, University of Cambridge, and co-directs the ICthinking research group. Since 2007, Dr. Boyd-MacMillan and colleagues at the University of Cambridge have pioneered an approach to address intergroup conflicts and extremisms, which uses an empirical measure frame with predictive results. I asked Dr. Boyd-MacMillan about what ICthinking might have to say about the links between cults and extreme groups just generally, as well as finding out more about the ICthinking project itself. Dr. Eolene Boyd-MacMillan, it's great to be able to talk with you today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you doing?
I can't complain. Thank you for agreeing to do this interview today. I actually saw one of your presentations in the autumn, which was hosted in partnership with Cambridge Enterprise. And so from that presentation, I got a real taste of what it is you're trying to do with the ICthinking project. You're using research to do with the way that people engage with difference and disagreement, and then applying that research in the real world.
Yes, that is exactly it. So first, I just want to say thank you for inviting me to speak with you. I think this is a really interesting topic, and I'm glad that we have this opportunity. So yes, in the ICthinking research group, we conduct our research in the real world. We use an approach or a method called participatory action research. And so we adhere to the rigorous ethical standards that we all are subject to, but we develop and test our theories with members of the public in communities and schools in real-world settings. And so the participants become co-researchers with us as we're seeking to understand, to prevent, and reduce destructive intergroup conflict and extremist violence. So we work at the intersection of research, practice, and policy. And that is a real challenge. But we think that it's mandatory for us to do that if we're trying to understand and address these really complex problems. And so as a result, we've pioneered a new educational field, a new professional practice field, both based on IC.
And IC, that's integrative complex thinking. That's what the IC stands for. That's a trademarked term as well.
Yes. So what is IC?
Well, yeah, I suppose that would be the next question, the obvious question. How did this project get started and, what's it all about?
Yes, right. So you're correct. IC stands for integrative complexity, and it refers to a concept, a measure, and an experience. So the concept and measure were developed by Professor Peter Sudfeld, Professor Philip Tetlock, Professor Luke Conway, and many others. And the validity and the reliability of the concept and the measure is based on over 40 years of research. So there's a really extensive, mature literature that's documenting the cross-cultural validity and reliability of the concept and the measure. So as a concept, IC, integrative complexity, refers to our thinking style, the less than conscious structure of our thinking when we're making decisions or processing information or solving problems. Is it a narrow thinking style that's black and white, tunnel vision, I'm right, you're wrong, we're good, you're bad, no exceptions, no qualifications? Or is it moving toward a more flexible, open thinking style that holds on to our own values and is able to see some validity in other viewpoints, able to see the bigger picture, maybe to recognize that we need more information, or that there can be change over time, or there's even mutual influence. They do that, we do that, and then they do that. Maybe if we did something different, they'd do something different. So that's IC as a concept, this less than conscious thinking style in the face of difference and disagreement. As a measure, IC captures a bundle of processes going on simultaneously inside us and also socially in the face of difference and disagreement. So low IC, or IC score 1, predicts destructive intergroup conflict or violence, whereas IC management, that's having the bigger picture, which is at IC score 2 or above, and that predicts more peaceful outcomes to conflict. So IC measures have predictive values. Low IC, this narrow tunnel vision, predicts destructive conflict and violence, and IC management, or high IC, predicts peaceful outcomes to conflict. And so because IC occurs at a less than conscious level, it's virtually unfakeable. We can't fake IC management at 2 or above. Either we're thinking in a more open, flexible way and seeing the bigger picture, or we're not. And this isn't about, a false harmony. It's not about saying, well, actually, there aren't any disagreements here and we all think the same thing and we all get on. That's just as low IC as not seeing any validity in any other viewpoint. They're both low IC. And you can't just say, well, I see what that other person's saying and I recognize their perspective, but I don't think there's any validity in it. So it's not just seeing another perspective just to dismiss it. It's about how we actually engage with other viewpoints, with difference and disagreement, while holding on to our own core values. That's what determines whether we're managing our IC or not. So this takes us to I see the experience. I see the concept, I see the measure, and now the experience. We all manage our IC, this bundle of processes that shape our thinking all the time. So for example, if we were at a bus stop and someone runs into us and they say something rude and then, run away, we would probably all go into low IC, which is this, I'm right, you're wrong. I'm good, you're bad. How could you have done that to me? But then after a few moments, we'd probably, move on and forget. We'd say, well, maybe they're having a bad day. Maybe they're in a hurry. Maybe they just got some bad news or they're suffering or something. But it's really difficult to do this when a conflict touches on our core identities and our core values, say our religion, our ethnicity, our politics, our economics, our family identity or community, and so on. It's difficult to move on and not to think we're right and they're wrong. And it's really important to notice or to be aware that moving from this tunnel vision, we're right, you're wrong, we're good, you're bad, to being able to see the bigger picture is not purely an individual process. It's a social process. Group identities, the groups that we're part of, really shape and inform our thinking. And groups of people behave differently from individuals. And so this gets into what you're wanting to focus on, which is cults.
Exactly, yeah. How this relates to cults, I think, is that cults and extreme groups in general, they're fairly similar in the way that IC thinking works. I suspect that the blinkers come down and, you've said IC1 is the low IC thinking style and then IC2 is the high IC thinking style. I suspect that a lot of people in cults, when it comes to matters that are related to their cult, that they will have an IC1 style of thinking. Is that right? Do you think?
I'm not an expert on cults. That's not my specialism. But from the research that I've read and the discussions I've had, it seems as if there are common patterns or shared patterns between cults and extremist groups. As you just said, the blinkers come down, IC score 1. And some of those shared patterns and strategies would perhaps be in the way that members are attracted, how members are retained, and the maintenance strategies that are used to keep people in these groups, whether a cult or extremist group. Which perhaps could be seen on a continuum. And a way to summarize that is what you've just said, that the groups operate to keep people in low IC, unable to move out of the tunnel vision. And that is done through group norms and strategies and rules that affect people physically, emotionally, cognitively, and socially, with, for example, severe penalties to prevent anyone from ever entertaining the thought that maybe what the group is saying is not the whole picture or isn't really the truth about what is going on in a particular situation. And what will happen is that if people, for example, start to question the group ideology or the group narrative, or question how the other group is being viewed, there would probably be severe punishments for having those questions, which keeps everybody in a state of threat, of constant anxiety, fear for survival. And so you stay in this low IC and you don't have the freedom or the flexibility to even start to manage your IC. You're just trying to survive. And it seems as if those are shared strategies and patterns between cults and extremisms.
Okay, great. So that makes intuitive sense, I think. But something mentioned in the presentation I saw was that one particular obstacle has been providing proof of model. The intervention programs that you've put into place, providing proof that they're actually working, does seem to be a bit of an issue sometimes. And in relation to cults, I can imagine that issues of access would definitely play a factor into that, applying the IC method in a cultic context, say.
Well, proofs are really important to researchers, and so you're correct on that. And there are different types of proofs, and they also work on different levels. So I mentioned the very extensive and mature literature base that IC, the concept, and IC, the measurement, is based on. And then we in the ICthinking research group pioneered this educational method and professional practice based on IC. And what some of that research shows is that low IC characterizes a range of extremist groups, which, and again, if cults and extremist groups are on a continuum, that means there are some groups that are in that overlap part of the continuum. And so some of the research looked at a range of groups from Northern Ireland territorial groups to right-wing extremist groups to animal rights violent groups and Islamicist extremist groups. And they found that all of them, the ideology, the narrative, and the thinking structure of members evidenced low IC, particularly just before they were about to commit a violent act. So that's one set of proof that we base our method on and our program on. But also, we ourselves set out to discover whether our hypothesis was correct, that IC management could actually be learned. Because remember, as a less than conscious capacity, our thinking style, that is, it's not just a set of skills or a toolkit. It occurs at a less than conscious level. So could we design a course program that would leverage IC and enable people to have IC management at IC score 2 or above? And we found out that we could. But the measures that we use to show that include the cross-culturally validated IC coding frame with pre-tests and post-tests that then we perform statistical analysis on to make sure that the change was significant and not simply a random effect. And we did find that as well. We also used resilience measures to see if there were statistically significant changes in resilience. We found that as well. We also used control groups with participants who were blind to being a control group going to an equally meaningful and popular course. And the pre and post tests involve asking participants to think about and what they think about their own group and what they think about the group that they oppose. And the control group didn't show any change in their IC management regarding the group that they opposed. In fact, it even went down slightly, whereas the groups that had been through our ICthinking courses all show statistically significant increases in their IC management, not only toward their own group, but the groups that they oppose. So that's a battery of empirical measures that we have. We also used empirical longitudinal studies to see if the change in IC management was robust and enduring. And we found that 1 year on, the IC increases were steady at 3 or above. And then we've also used qualitative measures, so self-reports at the end of the course, observer reports at the end of the course, and also 6 months on, participants coming back and being interviewed, and then also over 22 months later, we have an interview with participants and observers who went through an IC course where they talked about the significance the course was still having in their lives, and the observers were also reporting that they were seeing the changes were enduring and steady. And you can actually see an excerpt from the 22-month interview on a YouTube channel, either IC Graham High or in the IC Scotland YouTube channel. And there's a 4-minute version with subtitles and a 9-minute version. So yes, this proof of model was the next proof that we needed, and that was that we could find these same changes not just in one context or regarding one conflict, but across different socioeconomic groups, different contexts, different conflicts. And so we have run these empirical measures in England and Scotland, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kenya, in Macedonia, in Finland, in Pakistan, and we're also developing a course in Sweden and also in Northern Ireland. Some of this is already published, some of it's not published yet. It's in writing, or we're writing it up, but you can find journal articles on the work that we've done in England and Scotland and Kenya particularly. So proof is always a challenge, and we have worked really hard to get a 360-degree picture of the change that our ICthinking courses affect, with a whole range of groups and backgrounds and ethnicities and conflicts that are the source of the intergroup problems.
When you're talking about all these different contexts, do you have to change what you do in terms of the issues that you see in particular contexts?
Yes. So the ICthinking method has a skeleton that we use in every context. It's what we know will achieve these significant increases in IC management. And then we use research and development to create what we call the skin and the clothing according to each context. And so by the skin, I mean hot topics that are being debated in a particular context, whether that's ethnic or political or economic or religious. And then by clothing, I mean the images, the music, the films, the cultural memes that are appropriate for that context. And we collaborate with our partners to create the clothing that is appropriate. So we have a skeleton, that's the method that we have proof that we know works in these different contexts. And then we have the skin and the clothing that is part of how we make sure that when participants come to the course, that they recognize the course content and they can inhabit it and they can engage in the group learning activities, the role play, because IC courses are very experiential, they're participatory, they use multimedia, they're very active. It's not someone standing up and lecturing. It's very group-based, social, active, very physical.
Very interactive.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, someone who's joined an extreme group, they didn't have these low IC thinking styles about that group before they joined the group. So it makes sense for them to be able to unlearn that behavior, that way of thinking.
Well, we don't say, oh, before you were like this and now you're like that. So we don't target particular groups. We don't profile. We go into the context that we're invited to go into. And oftentimes we work with a range of groups. So sometimes it might be primary prevention, where you spread the net very widely, and you have some participants who maybe have thought about being involved or not. We don't know. We don't profile our participants. And we design the course not to give rules or regulations or to say, this is dangerous, you shouldn't do that. Rather, we use an indirect approach where perhaps we might teach them about something like framing, and we might show a sports figure, and the sports figure is showing lots of different emotions, and we say, now you pretend you're paparazzi. Would you frame this as all good or all bad? Your editor has said you have to write this up as all good or all bad. So which would you do it as? And some would say, oh, I think it's really good. They're showing lots of emotion and they're really keen on the game and they are, showing they're passionate and they care. And this other group might say, we think it's all bad. They should show more self-control. They need to be more sportsmanlike. So you have the polarization there. And then we would talk about, see how you can have different interpretations of the same behavior and different reasons for the same interpretations and different interpretations with the same reasons. So then we'd say, and not only can we frame, as paparazzi, we can frame with words, and we can use tricks with words, and in order to get people to think what we want them to think. And we talk about, the polarization, all good, all bad, is low IC. And so if you want to get people to move into low IC, you can use low IC tricks with words to get other people to be in low IC. So then we would teach them some rhetorical strategies, which go back to Aristotle and Cicero, but we call them tricks with words, and we teach them those, and then we would show perhaps some inflammatory statements that are relevant to their context that they may have heard. And we say, we know these are inflammatory, but identify the trick with words that is being used here. So it's a game, a contest. And this is supporting their critical thinking skills. It also supports their media literacy. And instead of focusing in on the content of what's being said, we're focusing on the structure of how it's being said. So people don't get defensive. They're actually enjoying themselves. And then after we've gone through that process, we might have a brief discussion about the content. But our focus is not to change what people believe. It's to get them to be able to respect difference and work with those with whom they disagree. So there may be something inflammatory shown that someone agrees with, or someone in their home agrees with, or someone in their community agrees with. Okay, that may be something you think, but are you able to respect those who don't think that? So the focus is on behavior and not beliefs. So the course that is experiential and participatory and interactive is not trying to tell people what to think. We're actually supporting them to think for themselves so they can use their critical thinking, so they can start to ask the questions and understand what's going on in public environments when people may be trying to manipulate them by using framing, by using particular rhetorical strategies.
So that's interesting, is that you're talking about using these trick words in this safe environment so that people can get used to what it's like to be manipulated. And then I suppose they go out into the real world and they're sort of inoculated somehow. Is this the idea?
No, I mean, we don't manipulate them and we don't use trick words. We teach them the tricks that are used with words. So they say thin end of the wedge, or caricatures, or black and white contrast followed by a list of three. So these are rhetorical strategies that you can hear being used by all sorts of different people and that we may use ourselves. And so it's to start to recognize the structure of thinking that can be used when people are trying to manipulate us, or when we may be trying to manipulate others.
Right.
So then if they recognize these tricks, when they're listening to someone, they can say, I know what that person's doing. And perhaps they're in low IC and maybe they're trying to get me into low IC. And what can I do to manage my IC here? There might be some validity in what they're saying, but maybe there's some things that I don't agree with in what they're saying. So management is not about not being open to what other people are saying. That's the opposite of it. It's knowing what your core values are and then being able to hear other viewpoints, but not to be manipulated by it. But we certainly don't use manipulation in the course at all. We teach them the tricks, and then we create a game where they can identify the tricks that we're listening to or that we're seeing in an image.
Right. So it's not that you're tricking them, you're just showing them how it would be done.
Yes, and then they have a contest to identify as many tricks as possible as what's being said in a particular statement or in an image. And then whoever identifies the most tricks wins with that one, sort of thing. So in other words, we've created a safe context to actually hear some of what is being said in the public domain, either on social media or, in the school or in the communities, and then to be able to engage with it without people becoming defensive or without the manipulation happening. Let's talk about what is actually being said, and let's understand the structure of thinking behind what's being said, and then how can you have a little bit of detachment so that you're not manipulated.
This sounds very interesting because it seems to get at more than just the cognitive level of certain interventions. It seems to get at the emotional level as well. And so that's something I wanted to talk to you about, is the metacognition that's involved in the ICthinking method. But before I ask you about that, could you just make the differentiation clear between, you talked about primary participants. Could you make the differentiation clear between primary, secondary, and tertiary participants, please?
Yes. So primary prevention is when you're working with a broad range of participants. I think I said you spread the net widely, and these people probably are not involved in extremist groups or cults, but they might be targeted by those groups or they might not. So a wide range primary prevention where everyone goes through the course and everyone then has learned to manage their IC. And then secondary prevention is where you're working with groups, with people who have been involved in extremist groups. And then tertiary prevention is when you're working with groups where people are still actively involved in extremist groups. And as far as we know, we're the only group that, or the only program that works across the sharp edge to the broad end of prevention. So that's across primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, and our program has been found to be effective across that range. So that's the range of groups that we work with.
That's interesting because, yeah, you would think intuitively that there is a link between those various populations. So could I just ask you now about metacognition? I mean, when I think of metacognition from a psychological point of view, I'm thinking perhaps mainly stuff to do with the brain. But the way that ICthinking talks about metacognition, you're talking about the body being involved as well and emotional processes.
Exactly, yes. So it isn't just about our thinking, and there have been some methods that have tried to focus on logical reasoning in order to deter people or discourage people from being involved in various groups. And what we found is that using logical reasoning alone doesn't work. It can even backfire. So if you tell someone, don't get involved in this, this is dangerous, at some stages in our lives, particularly teenagers and young adults, when consequences don't loom as large in our thinking, telling someone that it might be dangerous or risky is like a red rag to a bull. You know, let me at it. This will be an adventure. Let me have fun. And that's actually a good thing. That's how people try new things and are open to new experiences, particularly young people who are trying to find their identity. But when you're trying to help people to understand why joining particular groups might not be helpful, you need to engage the whole person. So what's going on physically, what's going on emotionally, as you said, as well as what's going on cognitively or in their thinking, as well as socially. So that's why our approach is not a one-on-one approach, and there are lots of very effective one-on-one approaches out there, and that's fantastic. But we use a group approach so that people can understand the group dynamics, the social processes that are involved in our thinking, in our emotions, in our bodies, and the impact of our behavior in social contexts, and the impact of other people's behavior in social contexts. So we do work at all these different levels. We try to engage the whole person. And sometimes people say, well, emotions, we just need to get rid of them, and I don't think we should pay any attention to them, or I'm not very interested in them. And I want to say, well, you may not be interested in emotions, but emotions are very interested in you, and they're very involved in your thinking. There's an interplay between cognition and emotion or affect. And there's an interplay between our bodies and our emotion or affect and our cognition. And the more we understand this, the more self-aware we are, the more we can then be aware of others. And also, on top of that, the social processes that are involved in our thinking and our emotion. And when we understand the interplay between these different processes inside us, participants tell us how empowered they feel and how much more confident they feel, because they feel that they can manage themselves more and they can even help others. So we've worked with prisoners who talk about going back into the prison environment, and when someone else is very upset, they're so excited that not only can they keep themselves calm, but they can help the other person to calm down too. So there can be a ripple effect. And we're delighted that participants do feel this increased empowerment and this increased confidence to go into situations with difference and disagreement and be able to stay true to their core values rather than losing touch with themselves and being swept along in what is happening in a group. Because when we talk about the strategies and the patterns that characterize cults and extremist groups, it's the sense in which your personal empathy and your personal personal values recede to the background, and it's the group identity and the group values and the group emotion that comes to the foreground. And people can actually lose touch with their personal compassion that they would normally have toward members of the other group, and find themselves doing things that they wouldn't normally do that would go against their own personal morality because of the group norms, because of the group processes that are involved in these groups that are closed, that have these norms that ensure that you toe the line, that you can't contemplate thinking any other way. And when we're aware of that, we have more choices. We're more empowered.
Yeah, because someone who has not just made a purely cognitive decision to join a group that's extreme or a cult or something, you can't reason your way out of a situation that you haven't reasoned yourself into. Like you say, it's a cognitive, social, emotional, physical thing.
Exactly. So you need the metacognition, you need the meta-affective reasoning, you need embodied cognition.
And at the base level, it seems like you're trying to teach people, well, maybe teach is the wrong word, but show people perhaps how to be comfortable with ambivalence or something like this.
Yes, I think you could put it that way, that you're trying to help people to be maybe even more fundamentally comfortable with being uncomfortable, that we're trying to teach people or help people to be comfortable with more of reality, with seeing more of reality, because that's what IC management does. You hold on to your core values, but you're able to engage with more of reality, other viewpoints, other values, other ways of looking at things. And I think that's a good way of describing it, because IC management is not fun all the time. One might be more resilient, more empowered, more confident, but it can be awkward moving from this black and white, right and wrong sort of mindset or way of thinking into a more open, flexible way of thinking. Because when you're in the tunnel vision, you know what's going on. You have the rules. You know who's in, who's out. You know what the rules are to live by.
It's quite a simple thing.
Exactly.
In or out, yeah.
Exactly. And it's comfortable, it's familiar, it makes sense, you feel safe, you have a sense of security. And so moving out of that can be scary. And so it's helping people to be willing to feel that discomfort. All learning involves some level of discomfort. So to be able to tolerate that maybe there is black and white, but there are shades of gray, the ambiguity or the ambivalence that you mentioned, that there are other ways of looking at it, that we don't have all the information, that there is change over time, that there are, underlying shared values, even with those with whom we disagree. And that can feel kind of uncomfortable and a little awkward. And this is getting to the IC experience that I mentioned earlier, that we all have an IC journey that we're going on, and it's lifelong. And we can choose to manage ourselves so that we're able to tolerate a little bit of discomfort in order to enjoy and see more of reality. So being a little more comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Related to that, I can imagine that someone who's in a cult and is in a very metaphysically comfortable state of mind and state of being, if you were to somehow force them out of that experience, they would really resent it. Now, it just seems like a sort of sketchy, almost dangerous thing to be playing with, if you know what I'm getting at.
I think maybe you're wondering if in our IC programs we tell people what you believe is not true or not right or something, or if we're...
Yeah, something like this, yeah.
Are ripping out their canopy of meaning, for example. And just to say, we do not do that. We're supporting and empowering people to think for themselves. I mean, that's the bottom line of what we're doing. That's why we focus on behaviors and not beliefs. So each of our courses have guidelines that create the safe context, and these guidelines create a safe context in which participants tell us that that's why one reason why the course was so powerful for them is because they felt that they could say what they thought and they could explore what they really think without being told that they're wrong all the time. So it may be that as people are going through the course, our thoughts, our emotions, our identities, our beliefs, our social relationships are organic processes that are constantly shifting, particularly in a safe environment, with or without IC courses. We may be in a context, a group, where we're not allowed to let them to shift, or we're not allowed to show that maybe we have any questions. But these are organic processes. They're not static. And so with an IC course, these shifts are supported so that people can just look at what they think. Sometimes people would say, well, I think this. And then when we invite them to talk about that, they never realize that someone thought something different, or they'd never been asked what their values were. And so the very first time they're articulating what their underlying values are on a particular topic. And they may never have been asked or enabled to talk on that level. So we would not rip out anyone's canopy of meaning. They might find themselves asking some questions, and they'll be supported in that. And then we also work with our partner organizations to make sure that if people are troubled, or they have any questions, ongoing questions, or they want to explore something further, that there are people that are available to talk with them. So they have resources and safe people to talk to if they want to explore something, or, take questions further. But we focus on how people behave in group environments, not on what their beliefs are.
So Sarah mentioned something in the presentation. This is Dr. Sarah Savage. She mentioned something in the presentation that I saw about the program you had running in Bosnia, where you didn't explicitly mention the war there, but it was something that the participants brought up themselves. So this ties in with what you're saying about the program being something as empowering.
Yes, that also connects to what I was talking about earlier in terms of maybe introducing framing, and with a fun activity where people have frames, all good, all bad, and then teaching about tricks with words, and then creating a game where they identify the tricks with words being used. And then maybe after going through all of those group activities that are physical and fun, and then maybe talking about the content, because the participants bring it up. So in Bosnia-Herzegovina, the course uses film as the context, using different narrative structures in films to just talk about different situations that have nothing to do with Bosnia-Herzegovina. And then participants may say, well, we had a war here. This is like what we went through there. And then the trained, qualified co-facilitators can say, oh, so you're making this connection between what we've been doing with what you've experienced. Would you like to say any more about that? And so that's how the hot topics can be brought into the room, particularly if you're working in a fragile context that's just post-conflict, or maybe the conflict is still going on in some places. We allow the participants to bring up what is relevant to them, so that it will enable participants to talk about something if they feel safe doing so. And so that is very empowering. They feel empowered. At last, we can talk about what we've wanted to talk about, but we haven't had a safe space to do that. And so that's how their confidence increases, their self-efficacy increases, their sense of agency increases through these experiences they have of being able to talk about difficult things in a safe way. And then that starts to elicit hope that they can do this elsewhere. And that's what they find, because they'll practice what they're experiencing between the course sessions, and they'll come back and say, I did this at school, or I did this with my family, or I did this with my friends in my community, and this is what happened, and it was great. I did this in my prison, or wherever a person is located, or a particular participant group is coming from. So yes, that is part of the empowering.
When you made the differentiation between primary, secondary, and tertiary, it seems if you're dealing with tertiary prevention, there's obviously whoever's in charge of running that prevention program wants to see results that are tangible. They want to stop people from shooting each other at the end of the day. It might seem as though there is an ulterior motive. It's not just about empowering people. And so in line with that avenue of thought, do you think that there is an essential difference between violent groups and non-violent groups?
Well, if you're talking about extremist groups, so can you have an extremist group that has extremist beliefs but doesn't seem to recommend violence, and then an extremist violent group. What is the relationship between extremist beliefs and extremist violence?
Yeah, I suppose that's the question I'm asking,
Yeah, and this is hotly debated. The research seems to show that there is no assembly line between extremist beliefs and extremist violence. In other words, it's not an automatic, assembly process where you're on the conveyor belt heading toward violence the minute you have extremist beliefs. And people can commit extremist violence without having extremist beliefs and later having the extremist beliefs. So it can go both directions. The conveyor belt can go in either direction, and it's not a conveyor belt. But we also know that groups with extremist beliefs can provide hospitable environments or sympathizers or supporters for extremist violence. So it can be that, well, we wouldn't do that, but we think it's good that they're doing that. And we think that that group deserves what they're getting and that sort of thing. And we have to get them before they get us, but we won't use the violence. So there can be a relationship. We would say that in the relationship between behavior and beliefs, there's not a clear connection, although there is some sort of connection. And because our behaviors can shape our thinking as much as our thinking can shape our behaviors, we focus on behaviors. So, for example, if someone would say, well, I have these extremist beliefs, but I would never commit violence, then we could take that further and say, well, how do you engage with those with whom you disagree, who don't think that? Are you able to work with them? Are you able to respect them? Are you able to have pro-social relationships with them in your community? And if so, then that means that there is IC management going on. If we have beliefs that we might characterize as extreme, and probably all of us do, because the definition of extremist beliefs is having any sort of polarized view in, for example, environmental realm or a political realm or religious realm. I think all religions are rubbish, or I think there's only one true religion, or, environmental, and that everyone needs to stop driving cars right now, or in an ethical realm, all slavery is wrong. So we all probably have extremist views in one dimension or another. But how do we interact and engage with those with whom we disagree? So, are we able to respect that people will see things differently? And can we work for change in pro-social ways, not using violence, not using destructive conflict, not using, oppression, discrimination against the other? So that's what IC management is about. And the relationship between beliefs and behaviors is an interesting one, but it's not clear-cut. And so that's why we focus on the behaviors.
There's a couple of points that brings up for me. So one would be the adaptive nature of IC thinking, and the other one would be perhaps the difficulty of showing that something truly preventative, like the IC model, the difficulty of showing that it's working, because you're stopping something from happening before it's actually happened. So on that first point, low IC can be a sort of heuristic, right? It can be very adaptive. I can imagine that most people who are in a group of any kind, they would think of their group as being better naturally than any other group.
Yes. So groups are not all bad. So in IC courses, we're not trying to characterize groups as bad or evil. Groups are good. We're able to accomplish more when we're in groups. There can be groups that say we pick up all our litter and we are all honest or something. So groups can accomplish things together and have moral stances. But there can be a shadow side to groups. And the shadow side is when it moves from we think we're a good group, or else why would we belong to it? We think we're better than all other groups. We think the other groups are out to get us. We better get them before they get us. It's this trajectory of thought. So if we have low IC on a topic like littering or honesty or slavery or religion, that's fine, as long as then we can respect those who disagree with us and work pro-socially with them. And if we can, then we actually are managing our IC. So it's not about letting go of our core values. It's about holding on to them, but also being able to respect with difference and disagreement. And we might have different IC levels, so-called, going on at the same time in us. And if so, that's IC management. So I might be low IC on a topic, but high IC on people, not reducing people to their viewpoints. But everyone has a backstory. Everyone has experiences, which one wouldn't use to justify or validate whatever they do, but not dehumanizing others and not reducing them just to their stance on a particular topic. So IC management would be about perhaps low IC on a topic, but high IC on people.
Interesting. And that second point that I mentioned is the pre-crime. I think that's how I'd best put it, the pre-crime sort of aspect of the IC method. You know, if you're trying to put into place a truly preventative model, it seems hard to be able to show that it's working because you're stopping something before it happens.
Yes.
Like Minority Report or something.
Yes, exactly. The dilemma. And so that's true. If you're claiming that something is preventing something from happening, how did you know that it was going to happen?
Sure, because you're saying the IC method is a good predictor of violence, right?
Well, that is what we would use. We know that when the IC of a group drops, that does predict violence and destructive conflict. And we know that when IC increases, when IC management is at work, that predicts more peaceful outcomes. So particularly in primary prevention, if we are working with a group and we don't know if any of those people would have ever become members of extremist groups or cults or involved in destructive conflict. But we do know that they're more able to work with those with who they disagree with, not only from their own reports, but what others see of them. When we ask them about what they think about their outgroup a year on, they're still at IC score 3. And when we ask them to talk about how they're doing with the course almost 2 years on, they're still using their IC and others are still seeing them use IC. So you never know who might have done something who then doesn't, and you can't ever prove that. But we can say that people are continuing to see themselves and others are seeing them as being able to work with people in more pro-social ways than they were beforehand. When you're working in secondary or tertiary groups, you can look at recidivism and whether those rates go down or not. And the group that we're working with in Pakistan has a 0 recidivism rate, which is pretty amazing. They're working with people who have been recruited to violence extremist groups and have been active, and none of them return to those groups, and that's a pretty amazing statistic. And we know that the ICthinking program is a key part of their success, alongside other parts of their program that are also very effective.
That's quite remarkable, and it really speaks to this clothing of the skeleton that you were talking about before, but changing the method ever so slightly so that it suits each context.
I'll just say a little bit more about that, because the method doesn't change, but the skin and the clothing do. So what we know will increase people's IC management, the types of group activities that are needed to do that. The types of activities that we know will work are the same, but they definitely will maybe be delivered differently with different groups. If you're working with a group that is used to rote learning and they're not used to saying what they think on a topic because all that they're taught is to repeat what the teacher says or to just memorize, then you need to have a different approach working with them. And so when I say we adapt, and that's the skin and the clothing, we might deliver it differently, we might design it differently, but the underlying mechanisms of change are the same.
The method stays the same. That's an important point to remember. So what I wanted to ask you next was about issues of access. It's something I touched on earlier. It seems like the groups that are hardest to access, or the ones who are least amenable to joining in with this, are the ones who probably need the most help. How do you combat that problem? Do you just target people when they're young? Is this something that you want to see rolled out in schools?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And there are two parts to your question there. So first of all, the very last bit, yes, we do hope and advocate for IC courses being rolled out in schools from nursery to primary to secondary to further education, higher education, in workplaces as widely as possible. And that is how access can be achieved, particularly because in intergroup conflict and extremist groups and cults, you have this us versus them, group polarization. So it's important to be able to work with people on all sides of the polarization, potentially or de facto already there. In terms of working with groups that are, extremist violence groups, I mean, we go where we're invited, and I don't think an extremist violent group would invite us to work with them.
No.
But that's then where if one is working in prisons, and what's really interesting, and we particularly worked in prisons in Scotland, and what we've really respected there is that the Scottish Prison Service has seen that IC is not only about individual agency, that you have to think about structures and systems as well. And so they have a vision of being what we might call an IC learning ecosystem, where the structures and systems of the prison, the staff of the prison, that their IC management capacities are supported and increased, as well as then the people that are in their care. And in the Scottish Prison Service, they talk about offenders and prisoners as the people in their care. That is ideal, to be able to work with the environment, the structures and systems, as well as the individuals involved in those structures and systems, whether it's practitioners, whether it's people in other people's care, custodial care or something. And that's actually what we do in schools and all of the organizations that we're invited into. So staff go through IC courses and they learn about IC management so that they're able to support the students' IC management as well. And it becomes part of their professional practices, part of their continuing professional development. So that's how we see access, trying to work with people as young as possible, whether in communities or schools or in places of employment or organizations, as well as working in places where people who have already been involved in groups that have been destructive and violent, that they also can learn about IC management as well. And in fact, when we've worked with prisoners, long-term prisoners who've been given permission to go through the course, they'll say, why didn't we learn about this at school? And if they're still in touch with their children, they'll say things like, why aren't our children, learning about this, if they have children? So those who have been in groups that have not been beneficial, that have resulted in harm to themselves and to others, they see the need for this as well.
So you'd like to see quite a wide rollout of this program. It leads me to think that perhaps there's something a little bit dangerous about, I'd heard Dr. David Good talking about the dangers of this method, if it got into the wrong hands sort of thing. And I can imagine the UK government, for instance, being a little bit wary about rolling this out so ubiquitously. I suppose it would have to be carefully at the moment.
Well, we do work with the UK government and with the Scottish government and other parts of the UK government, Home Office. We've been commissioned to design and run the courses, also with the city of Helsinki in Finland and different governments in different countries and different parts of the world. My understanding of what David was talking about, and we've been aware of this as well from the beginning, is that if someone had a particular agenda that they wanted to promote, they could try to use IC to promote that, but then they wouldn't actually be doing what we're doing. So we're very careful not to have a particular agenda embedded in our courses that's either humanistic or scientific or religious. It's religion friendly, it's humanism friendly, it's science friendly, and it's theory based, but we're not trying to promote a particular agenda or approach or a particular viewpoint that this field or one field has all the answers. So if someone wanted to call themselves ICthinking, but then they'd be prosecuted because, as you mentioned at the beginning, the ICthinking...
It's trademarked, yeah.
Trademarked, exactly. But if they tried to use IC in that way, that could be dangerous, but then they wouldn't actually be promoting IC management. So we work with our partners. Anyone who's co-facilitating an IC course has to go through rigorous training and qualification and accreditation and be observed, and there's continuing professional development. And they have to evidence that they're on the IC journey themselves, that they are actively using IC management in all areas of their lives before they can be a professional practitioner. But like any effective method, it can get hijacked, and we are rigorous in ensuring that we're not used in that way.
One of the safeguards I think you have is it would be impossible for me to get my individual IC score.
Yes. So we do not give participants IC scores. I mean, it's invalid. That's not how the concept or the measures work. You can't say to someone, you're this. It's not a profile like an IQ score or something like that.
Is that because it's socially situated?
It's socially situated, and also it's domain specific. So
right.
People maybe have different IC scores on different topics at different times in their lives and in different situations. It's socially situated. It's also environmentally what's going on. Are they feeling particularly stressed or anxious? That sort of thing, which is why we're very proud or excited about our empirical measures, because it's very difficult to capture IC change under test conditions. And that's what we use with our pre and post tests. So we don't assign IC scores to individuals. We aggregate participants' responses and the IC coding that is done, and we have trained, qualified IC coders, and every set of data is coded twice by two coders working independently before they confer, and then we use statistical analysis for intercoder reliability, and we ensure that our intercoder reliability is high using both Cohen and alpha, and then we produce group results. And the analysis does use matched pairs between pre and post, but the results that we publish are always aggregated and they're always anonymized without any identifying characteristics. So we do sometimes have individuals say, I want to know what my IC score was. We say, sorry, we can't do that. And we don't provide our data. Is not open to anyone. No one can mine it or use it to try to create a profile of anyone. And we don't target individuals. We don't provide profiles. And all our data is anonymized.
So I think we're coming towards the end of the interview now, and one last question that I'll ask is, do you think that there can be healthy extreme groups?
Okay. Healthy or constructive cults and extreme groups.
Yeah.
It seems that some people have experienced membership in a cult or an extreme group as a stepping stone on their life journey that they learned from. The risk is that while people are involved in a cult or an extreme group or another type of extreme group, that they may harm themselves or they may harm other people. And so, if a cult by definition or an extreme group by definition is one that is preventing members from being able to consider other viewpoints, there's a depersonalization process that's going on, and there's perhaps a dehumanization of the other going on, that by definition is not necessarily healthy. Can people be involved in that and learn from it and move on? Yes, but the risk of harming themselves or harming others while they are part of that is a pretty big risk. And there are other ways to have the same kinds of learning without being part of, a closed, inflexible group. So if the group has perhaps, what we might call extreme views on a particular issue, say like the environment or ethical or religious or something, if that group is still open, then it's not a cult or it's not an extreme group. It's still able to allow people to come and go, is still able to engage with those with whom they disagree. So I would be cautious about saying there's such a thing as a healthy cult if we're defining cult as a closed group that doesn't allow questioning, doesn't allow personal differences, and characterizes those outside the group as dehumanized in some way, as completely wrong.
So it depends on the definition. definitely.
Yes, I think the definition's important here. There's a really interesting paper that was published jointly by the Radicalization Awareness Network and also the International Cultic Studies Association, which is called Lessons from Adjacent Fields Cults, that I think lays out the issues about the spectrum on which cults and extremist groups lie and the overlaps between them, and looks at the definitions. And I think that's particularly in the Appendix 1 of that paper. So if people are interested in that, I highly recommend that paper to them.
Perfect. Thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. I'd like to say one thing more. I want to give a quote from Mary Beard, who is professor of classics here at Cambridge University. She wrote a book recently called Women in Power, and I would like to paraphrase a quote that appears on the back of the book, where she said, "You can't easily fit," and goes on to talk about women. But I'm going to paraphrase it using IC. You cannot easily fit high IC or IC management into a structure that is already coded as low IC. You have to change the structure. That is exactly what we are finding. To help people to manage their IC, we have to work with structures and systems, creating them to nurture, cultivate, and encourage people to manage their IC. And that's what we're doing through our organizational partnerships, through the ICthinking programs and professional practices. So it remains just to say thank you again for having this conversation with me, and it's been great to think about these topics in the ways that you've asked about them. Thank you again very much.
Thank you.